The cafeteria buzzed with the familiar clamor of military personnel grabbing their lunch before afternoon drills. Elena Vasquez wiped her hands on her apron, her keen eyes scanning the room with practiced indifference. For 30 years, she had served meals at Fort Benning with the same gentle smile, the same unhurried movements, the same forgettable presence that made her invisible to those who thought themselves important. And that was exactly how she wanted it. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning had started like any other. Elena arrived at 4:30 a.m., her silver-streaked hair tucked neatly under a hairnet, her weathered hands already knowing the rhythm of the kitchen. At 63, she moved with surprising agility, checking inventory and preparing the massive steel pots for the day's meals. The other kitchen staff called her Abuela, grandmother, though none knew she had never married, never had children. Her life, as they understood it, was simple. An immigrant who had found stability in serving those who served the country. What they didn't know was that Elena Vasquez wasn't her real name. The slight accent she carried wasn't from growing up in Barcelona, as she claimed, but carefully cultivated over decades of field work. The arthritis she occasionally complained about in her right hand was actually from a bullet wound sustained in Beirut in 1989. The reading glasses that hung around her neck contained a sophisticated microcamera that had documented countless classified conversations held by officers who never thought to watch their words around the lunch lady. "More beans, Coronel Rivera?" she asked, her voice warm and maternal as she served the base's newest commanding officer. He nodded without looking up from his tablet, just as she expected. People rarely looked at Elena, truly looked at her, and that had been her greatest asset since she'd been placed at Fort Benning in 1993 as part of Operation Longwatch. "Gracias," he muttered, already walking away, already forgetting her. Elena watched him go, mentally noting the secure phone in his breast pocket. That particular model had been the subject of her last transmission. The encryption protocols needed verification. The agency would be pleased. The morning continued without incident until 11:47 a.m., when 3 unfamiliar MPs entered the cafeteria. Their posture was different, alert, purposeful, scanning the room with the intensity of hunters. Elena noticed immediately but continued ladling soup, her expression unchanged. Something had happened. Someone had talked. 30 years of cover maintained flawlessly, and now something had shifted. She had contingencies for this moment. 3 separate escape routes from the base, dead drops in 4 locations across Columbus, Georgia, identities prepared in 3 countries. But as the MPs approached the serving line, Elena made a calculation. Running would confirm guilt. Staying might salvage the operation. The decision took less than a second. "Más sopa, cariño?" she asked the young lieutenant at the counter, her smile never faltering as the MPs positioned themselves strategically around her station. "Elena Vasquez?" the lead officer asked, his hand resting casually near his sidearm. The cafeteria had grown quieter, heads turning toward the confrontation. "Sai, that's me," she replied, setting down her ladle and wiping her hands on her apron. "Is something wrong with the food today?" Her voice carried just the right amount of confusion and deference, the tone of someone who had never been important enough to question. "You need to come with us, ma'am." His voice was flat, professional. Now, Elena allowed a flicker of worry to cross her face, just enough to be believable. "But the lunch rush. I cannot leave my station without permission from—" "This isn't a request," the second MP said, stepping closer. "Please turn around and place your hands behind your back." The cafeteria had fallen completely silent now. Hundreds of military personnel watched as the elderly lunch lady was being detained. Someone dropped a tray. A few people stood, uncertain whether to intervene. "There must be some mistake," Elena protested, her voice trembling slightly. "I have worked here for 30 years. I have done nothing wrong." The MPs exchanged glances, clearly uncomfortable with the public nature of the arrest but unwilling to back down. "Ma'am, we have orders. Please comply." Elena's shoulders slumped in apparent resignation. She turned slowly, presenting her wrists. The cold metal of handcuffs bit into her skin. Too tight, deliberately so. A small psychological tactic she recognized from her training at Langley decades ago. She allowed herself to wince appropriately. As they led her through the stunned cafeteria, she kept her head down, the perfect picture of a frightened civilian caught in the intimidating machinery of military justice. But her mind was racing. calculating. This wasn't a random security check. Someone had flagged her. After 3 decades of perfect cover, something had broken. The question was, how much did they know? They escorted her across the base, past the administrative buildings where she'd once placed listening devices during a renovation in 2001, past the communications center where she'd intercepted crucial intelligence during the early days of the War on Terror. Soldiers stopped and stared. A few of the older officers frowned, recognizing the woman who had served them meals for years. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. They brought her to the military police station, a squat building near the eastern perimeter. Inside, the air conditioning hummed aggressively, raising goosebumps on Elena's arms. They photographed her, took her fingerprints, removed her hairnet and apron, confiscated her reading glasses. Each item placed in a plastic evidence bag, each movement documented with military precision. "Please sit," the lead officer instructed, gesturing to a metal chair in a small, windowless room. Elena complied, folding her hands in her lap, the perfect image of an innocent, confused civilian. The room was standard interrogation setup. Table bolted to the floor, 2 chairs, a conspicuous camera in the corner, a large mirror that undoubtedly concealed observers. "Can someone please tell me what this is about?" she asked, her accent thickening with apparent distress. "I have done nothing wrong. I serve food. That is all." The MPs left without answering, the door closing with a definitive click. Elena sat perfectly still, knowing she was being observed. This was familiar territory. She had trained agents to withstand interrogation in rooms exactly like this one. The isolation, the uncertainty, the discomfort, all designed to destabilize the subject before questioning began. She used the time to analyze her situation. If they had concrete evidence of her espionage activities, she would already be in a black site, not a standard MP station. This suggested they had suspicions but not proof. Perhaps her cover identity had been flagged in a routine security review. Perhaps someone had noticed patterns in her movements. Perhaps there was a leak somewhere in the agency. The door opened after 27 minutes, a calculated time frame she knew, designed to increase anxiety without triggering formal detention protocols. A man entered wearing the insignia of military intelligence. Tall, lean, with the hard eyes of someone who had seen combat. He carried a thin folder. "Ms. Vasquez," he began, sitting across from her. "I'm Major Harrington. Do you know why you're here?" Elena blinked rapidly, as if fighting tears. "No, senor. I was serving lunch and then—" She gestured helplessly at her surroundings. Harrington opened the folder, removed a photograph, and slid it across the table. It showed Elena entering a storage shed near the base perimeter 3 days ago. "This area is restricted," he said. "Care to explain what you were doing there?" Elena leaned forward, squinting at the image. "I was looking for extra napkins and paper towels. The supply closet in the kitchen was empty." She looked up, her expression open and confused. "Was this not allowed? No one has said anything to me before about where I can go. And you needed to go at 2200 hours? After your shift ended?" His tone remained neutral, but his eyes watched her carefully. "I forgot my bus pass in my locker," she explained, the lie flowing easily. "I had to come back for it, and I noticed we were low on supplies, so I thought I would check while I was there." She paused, then added, "I have worked here for 30 years, Major. If this area was restricted, no one told me. I am very sorry." Harrington didn't respond immediately. He removed another photograph from the folder. This one showed Elena speaking with a man at a farmer's market in Columbus. "And this individual? Who is he?" Elena squinted at the photo, then nodded in recognition. "That is Miguel. He sells produce to the base. I sometimes see him at the market on Saturdays. We are from the same region in Spain." She tilted her head. "Is it forbidden to speak with him?" The questioning continued for nearly 2 hours. Each accusation veiled as a casual inquiry, each photograph presented as if it contained damning evidence. Elena maintained her persona flawlessly, confused, increasingly distressed, but transparently innocent. She allowed tears to well in her eyes at strategic moments, allowed her hands to tremble when Harrington's tone hardened. "You understand," he said finally, "that lying to a military officer during an investigation is a federal offense." "I have told you only the truth," Elena insisted, her voice cracking. "I serve food, I go home, I go to church. That is my life, for 30 years. Harrington gathered his photographs, closed the folder, and stood. "Wait here," he instructed, though she clearly had no choice in the matter. When the door closed behind him, Elena remained in character, shoulders slumped in exhaustion and worry. But internally, she was evaluating. They had surveillance on her, but nothing conclusive. The man they'd photographed her with at the farmer's market was indeed her handler, masterfully disguised as a local vendor. The storage shed had contained a dead drop point, accessed through a loose floorboard. Had they found it? If so, Harrington would have presented that evidence directly. This was not an arrest based on proof. This was a fishing expedition. Another 40 minutes passed before the door opened again. This time, a different officer entered, older, with the insignia of a colonel. Behind him came 2 more MPs, positioned themselves on either side of the door. "Miss Vasquez," the colonel began without introducing himself, "I apologize for keeping you waiting. There's been a misunderstanding that we need to clear up." Elena looked up, allowing hope to flicker across her features. "Then I can go? I can return to work?" "Not quite yet." The colonel sat, his movements deliberate. "We've contacted Immigration and Customs Enforcement regarding your status in this country." Elena's breath caught, a genuine reaction. This was an unexpected angle of attack. "My papers are in order," she said carefully. "I became a citizen in 1998. "Yes, we're aware of your naturalization," the colonel replied. "However, there appear to be some inconsistencies in your background check, discrepancies that weren't flagged at the time." "What discrepancies?" Elena asked, her voice small. The colonel leaned forward. "For instance, we can find no record of an Elena Vasquez born in Barcelona on the date listed in your file. No school records, no family members, no passport entries from Spain to the United States in 1990. Elena's mind raced. This was serious. Her cover identity had been created before digital records were standardized, before databases were interconnected globally. What had once been an impenetrable backstory now had vulnerabilities that hadn't existed when it was crafted. "There must be some mistake," she insisted, allowing real fear to enter her voice. "My documents were all approved. I have worked on this base for 30 years. "Yes," the colonel said slowly. 30 years serving meals to military personnel with access to classified information. 30 years moving freely around a secure military installation. 30 years of— What exactly, Ms. Vasquez?" Elena opened her mouth to respond, but the colonel raised his hand, silencing her. "Before you answer, I want you to consider your situation carefully. Falsifying immigration documents is a federal offense. Unauthorized presence on a military base is another. If ICE determines your citizenship was fraudulently obtained, you're looking at deportation at minimum, imprisonment at worst." The threat hung in the air between them. Elena allowed herself to tremble visibly, her eyes downcast. The performance was perfect. An elderly woman suddenly facing the collapse of the life she had built. "Colonel," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper, "I left Spain to escape an abusive husband. He was a powerful man in Barcelona. I changed some details in my paperwork because I was afraid he would find me." She looked up, tears streaming down her weathered cheeks. "That is the only lie I have ever told. Please, I have served American soldiers food for 3 decades. This is my home now." The colonel studied her face, searching for deception. Elena held his gaze, allowing vulnerability to show through. This was the moment of greatest danger. The lie within the lie, the constructed explanation for the inconsistencies they had found. After a long pause, the colonel nodded slightly. "We'll need to verify your story. In the meantime, you'll remain in custody." He stood, signaling the end of the interview. The MPs moved forward to escort Elena from the room. As she rose from her chair, legs stiff from hours of sitting, a commotion erupted in the hallway outside. Raised voices, the sound of rapid footsteps. Then the door burst open. A woman in a crisp civilian suit stood in the doorway, flanked by 2 men in dark glasses. She held up an identification badge that made the colonel straighten immediately. "This interview is over," she announced, her voice cutting through the tension in the room. "Ms. Vasquez is being released into our custody immediately." The colonel's face darkened. "And you are?" "Sarah Blackwood, Department of State, Special Diplomatic Security Division." She stepped further into the room, her authority palpable. "Colonel Peterson, I understand you were following protocol, but you've inadvertently interfered with a matter of national security." Elena kept her expression neutral, betraying nothing. She had never seen this woman before in her life, but she recognized an extraction when she saw one. The agency had been monitoring the situation and had decided to intervene directly, a significant risk that indicated the importance of her continued work. "I wasn't informed of any State Department operation on my base," the colonel protested, his posture stiffening defensively. "That's rather the point of classified operations, Colonel," Blackwood replied coolly. She turned to Elena. "Ms. Vasquez, if you'll come with us, please." Elena stood, still maintaining her confused, frightened demeanor. "I don't understand," she said, looking between Blackwood and the colonel. "It's all right," Blackwood assured her with practiced compassion. "Everything will be explained once we're secure." The colonel blocked their path to the door. "I need to see authorization for this." "Proper channels." One of Blackwood's companions stepped forward, offering a sealed envelope. "Your authorization, sir, signed by the Secretary of Defense. I believe you'll find everything in order." The colonel took the envelope, examined its contents with increasing discomfort, then reluctantly stepped aside. "This isn't protocol," he muttered. "Thank you for your cooperation, Colonel," Blackwood said, her tone making it clear the discussion was over. She turned to Elena. "Ms. Vasquez, shall we?" They escorted Elena from the room, through the MP station, and out into the blinding Georgia sunlight. A black SUV with tinted windows waited just outside. As they approached the vehicle, Elena maintained her bewildered expression, allowing Blackwood to guide her with a supportive hand on her elbow. Only when the doors closed and the vehicle pulled away from the MP station did Elena's demeanor change. Her shoulders straightened, the confused expression vanished, and her eyes sharpened with intelligence and calculation. "Cutting it rather close, wouldn't you say?" she remarked, her Spanish accent completely gone, replaced by crisp, accentless English. Blackwood smiled tightly. "Your extraction wasn't scheduled for another 3 months, but circumstances changed. Your cover was compromised at a higher level than anticipated." "Miguel?" Elena asked, thinking of her handler. "Secure. Already, on a plane back to Langley." Elena nodded, gazing out the window at the base that had been her home and operational theater for 3 decades. The cafeteria where she had served thousands of meals while gathering intelligence that had shaped American military policy. The barracks where young soldiers had confided their fears and secrets to the kindly lunch lady who always had a sympathetic ear. The officers' club where she had mopped floors after hours, planting listening devices that had intercepted crucial information during 3 armed conflicts. 30 years, she murmured. Longest deep cover assignment in agency history. "And the most productive," Blackwood confirmed. "Director Williams sends his personal thanks. The intelligence you gathered on Russian infiltration attempts alone justified your entire operation." Elena nodded absently, her mind already transitioning from the persona she had inhabited for so long to her true self. Magdalena Reyes, CIA operative, recruited from the Naval Intelligence Program in 1985, trained at the farm, deployed to multiple theaters before taking on the Elena Vasquez identity in 1993. "What's next?" she asked, turning from the window to face Blackwood. "Debriefing at Langley, obviously. Then." Blackwood hesitated. "The director has authorized your retirement if that's what you want. Full benefits, new identity, your choice of location. You've more than earned it." Quote. Magdalena considered this, as the SUV passed through the base gates. Retirement. After a lifetime of service, of living as someone else, of gathering intelligence that had saved countless American lives, the prospect felt both alluring and terrifying. "And if that's not what I want?" she asked. Blackwood smiled. "The director mentioned there might be a training position available. Your experience with deep cover operations is unparalleled. The next generation could learn a great deal from you." Magdalena nodded, feeling the weight of Elena Vasquez falling away with each mile that separated her from Fort Benning. The lunch lady was gone, her mission complete. What remained was a woman with unmatched skills, decades of experience, and a decision to make about her future. As the SUV merged onto the highway, heading toward the private airfield, where a jet waited to take her to Langley, Magdalena allowed herself a small smile. For 30 years, she had been invisible. The person no one noticed, the woman everyone underestimated. She had served meals and gathered secrets, had wiped tables and saved lives. And no one, not the soldiers she'd fed, not the officers she'd monitored, not even the MPs who had arrested her, had ever truly seen her. Until now. Until this moment of revelation, when Elena Vasquez disappeared and Magdalena Reyes emerged from the shadows, ready for whatever came next. The private jet touched down at Langley with the same understated efficiency that had characterized Magdalena's entire career. No fanfare, no audience, just the quiet completion of a mission decades in the making. As she descended the steps to the tarmac, the Virginia air felt different on her skin, heavier somehow, weighted with the significance of her return to the world she had left behind 30 years ago. A black sedan waited on the tarmac, engine idling. Sarah Blackwood held the door open, her face inscrutable in the fading light. "Welcome back, Reyes," she said as Magdalena slid into the back seat. "It's been a long time. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you." The drive to CIA headquarters passed in contemplative silence. Magdalena watched the familiar landscape roll by, the carefully manicured grounds, the unassuming buildings that belied their importance to national security. The last time she had been here, the Soviet Union had just collapsed. The internet was in its infancy. The Twin Towers still stood in New York. "How much has changed?" she asked finally, her voice soft in the quiet car. Blackwood glanced at her in the rearview mirror. "Everything and nothing. The players are different. The game remains the same." They passed through 3 security checkpoints before reaching the underground parking facility. Each guard scrutinized Magdalena's temporary credentials, their expressions revealing nothing. These men and women had no idea they were admitting a living legend, a ghost returning to the land of the living. The elevator descended to sub-level 3, a floor that didn't exist in any public blueprint of the building. When the doors opened, Director Williams himself stood waiting, his silver hair immaculately styled, his suit perfectly tailored. At 68, he still carried himself with the alertness of the field operative he had once been. "Magdalena," he said, extending his hand. "It's an honor to finally meet you in person." She took his hand, noting the firmness of his grip, the sincerity in his eyes. "Director, I've heard your voice on so many briefings over the years. Strange to put a face to it at last." He smiled, gesturing toward the hallway. "We have a lot to discuss, but first, I imagine you'd like to freshen up, perhaps change into something more. Yourself." Magdalena glanced down at her cafeteria uniform, the clothes of Elena Vasquez. They felt wrong now, like a costume after the play has ended. "That would be appreciated," she said. A female agent escorted her to a private suite, more comfortable than standard debriefing quarters, she noted. Inside, she found a closet of clothing in her size, a fully stocked bathroom, and a meal waiting on a small table. The care taken with these arrangements spoke volumes about her status within the agency. Magdalena showered, washing away the last physical traces of Elena Vasquez. As the hot water cascaded over her shoulders, she allowed herself a moment of genuine emotion, relief, grief, uncertainty, all mingling together. 30 years of discipline had taught her to compartmentalize her feelings, to save them for when they could be safely examined. This was such a moment. The woman who emerged from the bathroom 20 minutes later was transformed. Gone was the stooped posture, the carefully cultivated air of subservience. Gone was the softened voice and deferential manner. Magdalena Reyes stood tall, her silver hair cut in a sharp, elegant bob that framed her face. The tailored charcoal suit she had selected fit perfectly, emphasizing her still athletic figure. At 63, she moved with the confidence and precision of a woman half her age. 3 decades of maintaining her cover had required physical discipline as rigorous as mental, daily exercises performed in the privacy of her small apartment, martial arts practiced in the pre-dawn hours before her shift began. There was a soft knock at the door. "They're ready for you in the conference room," a voice announced. Magdalena took one last look in the mirror. The face that looked back was both familiar and strange. Elena's features rearranged into a new configuration of alertness and authority. She nodded at her reflection and turned away. The conference room was smaller than she expected, intimately arranged, with just 6 people seated around an oval table. Director Williams sat at the head, flanked by what Magdalena immediately identified as his inner circle: the Deputy Director of Operations, the Chief of Counterintelligence, and 3 senior analysts whose specialties she could only guess at. "Please sit," Williams invited, gesturing to the empty chair at his right hand, a position of honor that didn't go unnoticed by the others in the room. As Magdalena took her seat, Williams made brief introductions. No last names, only first names and areas of responsibility. Agency protocol, even at this level. "What you accomplished at Fort Benning," Williams began once the formalities were complete, "represents the longest and most successful deep cover operation in agency history. The intelligence you gathered over 3 decades has informed military strategy, counterintelligence operations, and diplomatic initiatives across 4 presidential administrations." Magdalena inclined her head slightly, acknowledging the praise without comment. "What makes your achievement even more remarkable," Williams continued, "is that you operated entirely alone, with minimal handler contact, adapting to technological and procedural changes that would have exposed a lesser operative." "The isolation was necessary," Magdalena said, her voice measured and precise. "Each handler contact represented a potential compromise. I limited those risks." The deputy director leaned forward. "Your work identifying Russian penetration agents in 2014 was particularly impressive. Without your intelligence, we would never have uncovered their network within Fort Benning's communications division. Or the Chinese attempt to infiltrate the drone program in 2020, added the counterintelligence chief. Williams raised a hand, stemming the flow of praise. "We have 3 days scheduled for comprehensive debriefing, which will begin tomorrow. Tonight is about welcoming you home and discussing your future. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story." Magdalena met his gaze directly. "And what future does the agency envision for an operative whose face was exposed on a military base and whose cover identity has been compromised?" Williams smiled. "That's the question, isn't it? From a security standpoint, Elena Vasquez is burned. But Magdalena Reyes—" He paused, considering his words carefully. "Your official status has been maintained as deep undercover, assigned to diplomatic service in South America. As far as any database is concerned, you've spent the last 30 years working at our embassies in various countries, recently returned to the States for reassignment." "A cover within a cover," Magdalena observed. "Precisely. Your documentation is impeccable, created and maintained by our best people over the decades. Which means you have options." The room fell silent as Williams opened a leather portfolio on the table before him. "Option 1, retirement. Full benefits, new identity if you want it, your choice of location. The agency will provide housing, security, whatever you need to build a comfortable civilian life." Magdalena nodded, waiting for him to continue. "Option 2, training. Your experience with deep cover operations is unparalleled. The farm could use someone with your expertise to prepare the next generation of field operatives." "And option 3? Magdalena asked, sensing there was more. Williams exchanged glances with his deputy director before continuing. "Option 3 is more unconventional. We have a developing situation that requires someone with your particular skill set. Someone who can operate independently, who understands long-term infiltration, and who can recognize the subtle signs of embedded foreign assets." Magdalena's interest was piqued despite herself. "What kind of situation?" "We've identified what appears to be a deep cover network operating within senior levels of multiple military branches. These aren't recent placements. They've been embedded for decades, much like yourself, working their way into positions of influence." "Russian?" she asked. "We believe so. though the tradecraft doesn't match current FSB or GRU methodologies. It's older, more subtle, likely agents placed during the late Soviet era, who've maintained their cover through the transition to modern Russia. Magdalena considered this. You're describing sleeper agents who've been active for at least 30 years. Why surface them now? The chief of counterintelligence spoke up. Because we have reason to believe they're being activated. 3 senior military officials with access to nuclear protocols have made unusual travel arrangements in the past month. Communication patterns have shifted. Small but significant deviations from established behavioral baselines. You want me to identify them, Magdalena stated, understanding dawning. Williams nodded. You spent 30 years hiding in plain sight. You know the techniques, the compromises, the small tells that even the best deep cover operative can't always conceal. We need someone who can recognize what our standard counterintelligence protocols might miss. It would be a short-term assignment, the deputy director added. 6 months, maximum. Consultant status, working directly with a small team under the director's personal authority. Magdalena leaned back in her chair, weighing the offer. After 30 years of isolation, of living as someone else, the prospect of retirement was undeniably appealing. She had earned her rest, yet the challenge presented was precisely the kind of work she was uniquely qualified to perform. Perhaps the only person in the agency with the right combination of experience and perspective. I need time to consider, she said finally. Williams nodded. Of course. Take tonight to think it over. We'll begin debriefing tomorrow at 09:00 regardless of your decision about future involvement. The meeting concluded shortly thereafter. Magdalena was escorted back to her suite, where she found a secure tablet waiting with a detailed briefing package on the suspected network. She spent hours reviewing the files, her analytical mind slipping easily back into operational assessment mode. The patterns were subtle, but unmistakable to her trained eye. Certain absences during key moments. Small inconsistencies in personal histories. Financial transactions that individually seemed innocent, but collectively formed a suspicious pattern. Whoever had assembled this initial intelligence had done solid work, but they lacked the perspective of someone who had lived the life of a deep cover operative. Around midnight, Magdalena set aside the tablet and moved to the window. Beyond the reinforced glass, the Virginia countryside was a tapestry of darkness broken by distant lights. Somewhere out there was the small apartment where Elena Vasquez had supposedly lived for 3 decades, a carefully maintained fiction with real utility bills, magazine subscriptions, and occasional visitors from the agency posing as relatives. Elena had never truly existed, yet Magdalena had been her for longer than she had been herself. The thought was disorienting. A soft knock at the door interrupted her contemplation. "Come in," she called, turning from the window. Sarah Blackwood entered, carrying 2 mugs of steaming liquid. "I thought you might be still awake," she said, offering one of the mugs. "It's tea. I remember the file mentioned you prefer it to coffee." Magdalena accepted the mug with a nod of thanks, noting the small gesture of personalization. "You've read my file." "Parts of it," Blackwood admitted, taking a seat in one of the armchairs. "The parts I'm cleared to see anyway. Your full operational history is restricted to the director and deputy director only." Magdalena sipped her tea. Earl Grey with a hint of honey, exactly as she preferred it. "And what exactly is your role in all this, Miss Blackwood?" "Sarah, please." She smiled slightly. "I'm the director's special liaison for high-value assets. I'll be your primary point of contact during your debriefing and whatever comes after." "You mean if I accept this assignment to hunt Soviet-era sleeper agents?" Blackwood didn't confirm or deny, maintaining professional ambiguity. "I'm here to make sure you have everything you need, regardless of what you decide." Magdalena studied the younger woman with practiced assessment. Mid-40s. Impeccable credentials, judging by her position. Intelligent eyes that revealed careful observation behind her professional demeanor. Not field-trained, her movements lacked the hyper-awareness that became second nature to operatives, but not purely administrative either. An interesting bridge between worlds. "How much do you know about deep cover work, Sarah?" Magdalena asked, moving to sit across from her. "Academically? Quite a bit. Practically? Nothing. Blackwood's honesty was refreshing. I understand the protocols, the psychology, the tradecraft, but I've never lived it. No one understands it until they've lived it, Magdalena said quietly. The constant vigilance. The way you begin to dream as your cover identity. The moment you realize you haven't thought in your native language for months. She paused, sipping her tea. The gradual understanding that you're becoming someone else, and that someday you'll have to find your way back to yourself, if there's anything left to find. Blackwood leaned forward, her expression thoughtful. Is that why you're hesitating to take the assignment? Because you need time to reclaim yourself first? The question was surprisingly perceptive. Magdalena considered it before responding. Partly, she admitted. But there's more to it. For 30 years, I lived as someone insignificant, someone easily overlooked, easily dismissed. I served food and wiped tables and faded into the background. I was, by design, forgettable. And now they're asking you to step into the spotlight, Blackwood observed. Exactly. This assignment would place me in direct contact with high-ranking military officials, with the Joint Chiefs, with people who wield real power. After 3 decades of invisibility, I'm not certain I can navigate that world effectively. Blackwood smiled. With respect, I think you're underestimating yourself. You didn't just maintain cover for 30 years. You gathered intelligence that shaped national security policy. You identified foreign agents that our best counterintelligence teams missed. You did all this while being perceived as just a lunch lady. Imagine what you could accomplish when people actually listen to what you have to say. The observation struck Magdalena with unexpected force. For 30 years, her power had come from being underestimated. What would it mean to operate from a position of acknowledged expertise and authority? Something to consider, she murmured. Blackwood stood, sensing Magdalena's need for solitude to process. For what it's worth, she said, moving toward the door. The director doesn't offer option 3 to just anyone. The fact that he presented it means he believes you're the only one who can do this job effectively. After Blackwood departed, Magdalena returned to the window, nursing the remainder of her tea as she contemplated her future. Retirement would offer peace but also a kind of emptiness after a lifetime of purpose. Training would allow her to share her knowledge, but in the controlled, artificial environment of the farm. The assignment offered a different path altogether. A chance to use her unique perspective to protect the country she had served in silence for so long. By dawn, she had made her decision. The debriefing began precisely at 09:00, conducted in a secure room 3 levels below ground. For 8 hours, Magdalena detailed 30 years of intelligence gathering. Names, dates, observed behaviors, patterns of communication, security vulnerabilities at Fort Benning that had never been addressed. She described the Russian officers who had visited in 2018, their particular interest in certain training facilities, the questions they had asked that seemed innocent but revealed specific intelligence objectives. The process continued for 3 days, with different specialists cycling in to focus on particular aspects of her work. Military analysts questioned her about troop movements and training protocols. Counterintelligence officers pressed for details about suspected foreign agents. Psychological operations experts were particularly interested in her observations about morale and mentality among different ranks during various conflicts. Throughout it all, Magdalena remained precise, professional, and utterly tireless. 3 decades of stored information flowed from her in an organized stream, her memory for details astonishing even the veteran intelligence officers. On the evening of the 3rd day, as the formal debriefing concluded, Director Williams invited her to his private office, a rare honor that signified the importance of their conversation. "You've given us a wealth of intelligence," he said, pouring 2 glasses of scotch from a crystal decanter. "Our analysts will be processing it for months." He offered her one of the glasses. "Have you made your decision about our proposal?" Magdalena accepted the scotch, appreciating the rich amber color in the soft lighting of the office. "I have," she replied. "I'll take the assignment." Williams nodded, his expression revealing neither surprise nor relief. "May I ask what convinced you?" Something Sarah Blackwood said, Magdalena admitted. She pointed out that I've spent 30 years gathering intelligence while being invisible. Perhaps it's time to see what I can accomplish when people actually hear what I have to say. Blackwood has good instincts, Williams observed. That's why I assigned her to you. He raised his glass slightly. To new beginnings, then. They clinked glasses, the crystal producing a clear, resonant tone. When do we begin? Magdalena asked. Tomorrow morning. 0800. You'll meet your team. Small, hand-picked, absolutely trustworthy. The Pentagon has been informed that we're bringing in a senior counterintelligence consultant to review security protocols. Your official cover is that you've recently returned from long-term assignment in South America. And my approach? Williams smiled slightly. That's entirely up to you. This is why we need you, Magdalena. You know how these sleeper agents think, how they maintain their cover, what small tells might reveal their true allegiance. We'll provide support, resources, access, but the methodology is yours to determine. Magdalena nodded, already formulating her strategy. I'll need complete access to personnel files, security clearance records, travel histories, and I want to conduct the initial interviews personally. You'll have everything you need, Williams assured her. This operation has presidential authorization. The stakes are too high for bureaucratic obstacles. As Magdalena sipped her scotch, she felt a familiar sense of purpose settling over her, the clarity that came with a well-defined mission. For 30 years, she had lived in the shadows, watching and listening as others made decisions that shaped world events. Now she would step into the light, using everything she had learned during those decades of invisible service. Elena Vasquez, the forgettable lunch lady, had disappeared forever. In her place stood Magdalena Reyes, spy hunter, intelligence expert, and perhaps the only person who could identify the ghosts hiding within America's military leadership. Two new beginnings. She echoed, raising her glass to meet the directors once more. The road ahead would be challenging, the stakes impossibly high, but after 30 years of serving in silence, Magdalena was ready to speak. And this time, the most powerful people in the country would listen. The Pentagon's East Corridor buzzed with whispered speculation as Magdalena strode through its hallowed halls. Her charcoal suit and purposeful gait caught the attention of generals and aides alike. This unfamiliar woman with a security clearance that outranked most of the building's occupants. Some mistook her for a visiting diplomat. Others assumed she must be a new presidential appointee. None guessed she had spent the last 30 years serving mashed potatoes in a military cafeteria. Ms. Reyes, the Joint Chiefs are waiting, announced the young lieutenant, escorting her to the secure briefing room. His posture remained rigid, professional, but curiosity radiated from him like heat. This woman had appeared from nowhere, carrying authorization from the highest levels of intelligence command. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Magdalena nodded acknowledgement, mentally preparing for the meeting ahead. Her first week as the agency's special counterintelligence consultant had been spent in preparation, reviewing personnel files, studying security protocols, analyzing the patterns that had alerted the agency to potential sleeper agents in the first place. Now came the true test, face-to-face encounters with the military's highest echelon, including those who might be Russian assets decades in the making. The briefing room fell silent as she entered. 6 men and 2 women in full military dress sat around the oval table, their collective rank representing the pinnacle of American military power. At the head of the table stood General Marcus Calloway, chairman of the Joint Chiefs, his weathered face a map of 4 decades in service. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice carrying the weight of authority, "this is Magdalena Reyes, our special consultant from the Central Intelligence Agency. She has been granted top-secret/SCI clearance and presidential authorization to review our security protocols. You will extend her every courtesy and full cooperation." His eyes swept the room, landing briefly on each officer. "This is not a request." Magdalena observed their reactions with practiced subtlety. Most showed the expected responses, professional curiosity, perhaps slight resentment at an outsider examining their domain. But 2 faces in particular caught her attention. Admiral Robert Hensley's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, and General Patricia West's right hand closed into a loose fist before deliberately relaxing. Small tells, Possibly meaningless, possibly not. Thank you, General Calloway, Magdalena said, her voice clear and confident. I appreciate the opportunity to work with such distinguished officers. She took her seat, placing a slim leather portfolio on the table before her. I understand my presence may seem unusual, but I assure you, this review is standard procedure for maintaining the integrity of our most sensitive protocols. The lie rolled off her tongue effortlessly. 3 decades of cover work had made deception second nature. This was no standard review. This was a hunt for Russian sleeper agents who had potentially infiltrated the highest levels of military command. The meeting proceeded with surface-level discussions of security clearance procedures, communication protocols, and access restrictions for nuclear command systems. Throughout, Magdalena watched and listened with the hyper-awareness she had developed during her years at Fort Benning. Who spoke too much? Who said too little? Whose questions revealed knowledge they shouldn't have? Whose answers seemed rehearsed? I'll need to conduct individual interviews with each of you over the coming days, she announced as the meeting concluded. My office will contact your staff to arrange convenient times. As the officers filed out, General Calloway remained behind, waiting until the room had cleared before speaking. So you're the specialist Williams sent, he said, studying her with newfound intensity. He didn't mention you'd be this direct. Magdalena met his gaze evenly. Would a more circuitous approach better serve our objectives, General? A hint of a smile crossed his face. Point taken, Ms. Reyes. He moved to the window, looking out over the Potomac. Williams briefed me privately about the real nature of your investigation. Russian sleepers, he said. Placed decades ago and potentially being activated now. That's our working theory, she confirmed, joining him at the window. The evidence is subtle but concerning. Calloway nodded slowly. These people, if they exist, have been my colleagues for years. Some are friends. He turned to face her, his expression grave. I need to know, how certain are you of this threat? Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Certain enough that the director sent me, Magdalena replied. But not so certain that we're making accusations without concrete evidence. That's why I'm here, to find that evidence or to eliminate the suspicion entirely. And these officers we suspect, do they know they're being investigated? Number. As far as anyone beyond this room knows, I'm conducting a routine security review. She paused, choosing her next words carefully. General, in my experience, the most dangerous adversaries are those who believe themselves above suspicion. The longer they've maintained their cover, the more confident they become in their invulnerability. Calloway's eyes narrowed slightly. You speak from experience. More than you know, she answered simply. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Sarah Blackwood, who knocked briefly before entering with a secure tablet in hand. Ms. Reyes, we've received the additional files you requested, she announced, her professional tone revealing nothing of their true purpose. Thank you, Ms. Blackwood. Magdalena turned back to Calloway. If you'll excuse me, General, I have preparations to make before tomorrow's interviews. As they left the Pentagon and settled into the secure vehicle waiting for them, Blackwood handed Magdalena the tablet. Initial background on the 3 primary suspects, she explained. Admiral Hensley, General West, and Lieutenant General Kruger, though he wasn't at today's meeting. Magdalena began reviewing the files immediately. What did we find in their travel patterns? Hensley made 3 trips to Vienna in the past year, all officially for NATO coordination, but he added personal days to each visit. West has a vacation home in Cyprus that she visits twice annually. Kruger regularly attends military technology conferences in Helsinki. All locations with known FSB presence, Magdalena noted. Convenient. There's more, Blackwood continued. Financial analysis shows unusual patterns in Hensley's investment portfolio. Nothing overtly suspicious. He's not suddenly wealthy, but his investment choices consistently avoid companies that might be negatively impacted by Russian market movements. As if someone with inside knowledge is guiding his decisions, Magdalena observed. What about personal connections? West's daughter married a businessman with extensive ties to Eastern European shipping companies. Several of those companies have been flagged by Treasury for potential sanctions violations. Kruger maintains close friendship with a Russian-American physics professor at Georgetown who emigrated in the late 1980s. Magdalena absorbed the information, her mind connecting patterns that others might miss. None of this is conclusive. If these are indeed Soviet-era sleeper agents, their legends would be meticulously crafted, their connections plausibly explained. So how do we prove it? Blackwood asked. We don't. Not yet. Magdalena set the tablet aside. First, we observe. We listen. We look for the inconsistencies that even the best-trained operatives can't eliminate entirely. The small habits formed during their original training. The linguistic patterns that might reveal Russian language thinking beneath English words. And then? Then we create pressure, controlled situations that might force a reaction. Something that would be natural for an American military officer, but counterintuitive for someone trained in Russian intelligence methodology. Blackwood looked impressed. You've clearly done this before. I've been on the other side, Magdalena corrected. I know what it feels like when someone is testing your cover. I know the fear that rises when you think you might have made a mistake, and I know how that fear can lead to bigger mistakes. The following morning, Magdalena began her interviews in a small, nondescript office provided by Pentagon security. The room contained a desk, 3 chairs, and absolutely nothing that might indicate the true nature of the conversations taking place within. Admiral Robert Hensley arrived precisely on time, his naval uniform impeccable, his demeanor professionally cordial. At 58, he carried himself with the confidence of a man who had navigated both literal and political waters with equal skill. Admiral, Magdalena greeted him, rising from behind the desk. Thank you for making time in your schedule. Of course, he replied, taking the offered seat. Always happy to cooperate with our intelligence colleagues, though I must admit, I'm curious about the timing of this security review. Magdalena smiled noncommittally. Periodic reviews are essential to maintaining robust protocols. As threats evolve, so must our safeguards. The interview began with standard questions about clearance procedures and communication channels, the expected content of a security review. Hensley answered each question with precision and apparent transparency. His knowledge of protocols was comprehensive, his explanations clear. Then Magdalena shifted tactics. Tell me about your time at the Naval Academy, Admiral, she said, abruptly changing both topic and tone. I understand you were quite the sailing champion in your youth. Hensley blinked, momentarily thrown by the change in direction. Yes, that's right. I captained the sailing team in my senior year. We took the intercollegiate championship in '88. Impressive, Magdalena commented. Do you still sail? When time permits. I keep a small sloop in Annapolis. And your father was in the Navy as well, correct? 3 generations of naval service, Hensley confirmed, pride evident in his voice. My grandfather served in the Pacific during World War II. My father was a submarine commander during the Cold War. Magdalena nodded, making a note in her file. Family traditions are powerful influences. Tell me, Admiral, where were you stationed when the Berlin Wall fell? Quote, another subtle shift, another test. Hensley's expression remained composed, but Magdalena noted a momentary tightening around his eyes. I was aboard the USS Theodore Roosevelt in the Mediterranean, he answered. We received news via secure communication. I remember the crew's reaction. Stunned disbelief followed by celebration. A historic moment, Magdalena agreed. How did you personally feel about it? Hensley hesitated. Briefly, almost imperceptibly, but enough for Magdalena to notice. Cautiously optimistic, he said finally. As a naval officer trained during the height of the Cold War, I was conditioned to view Soviet intentions skeptically. But like most Americans, I hoped it signaled a genuine shift toward peace. The answer was politically correct, professionally appropriate, and remarkably nonspecific for such a pivotal historical event. Magdalena made another note and continued, weaving personal questions between procedural ones, looking for patterns in his responses. Throughout the hour-long interview, Hensley maintained his composure. His answers revealed a decorated officer with an exemplary record, a man who had dedicated his life to naval service. Nothing, he said, explicitly raised red flags. Yet something felt off to Magdalena. His answers about family were detailed and emotional. His responses about naval operations were precise and technical. But when the conversation touched on Russia or the former Soviet Union, his answers became more measured, more generic, as if pulled from a State Department press release rather than personal experience. After Hensley departed, Magdalena reviewed her notes, adding observations about his body language, verbal patterns, and the subtle inconsistencies she had detected. Then she prepared for her next interview, General Patricia West. Unlike Hensley, West arrived 5 minutes early, her manner brisk and efficient. At 53, she had risen through Air Force ranks with remarkable speed, her expertise in strategic planning earning her a reputation as one of the military's most forward-thinking leaders. "Ms. Reyes," she greeted Magdalena with a firm handshake. "Let's make this productive, shall we? My schedule today is particularly tight." "I appreciate your time, General," Magdalena replied, gesturing to the chair across from her. "I'll be as efficient as possible." The interview with West followed a similar pattern. Standard security questions interspersed with personal inquiries designed to probe for inconsistencies. West's answers came rapidly, her thinking linear and logical. When asked about her childhood in Nebraska, she provided concise details about her family's farm, her education, her early interest in aviation. Then Magdalena introduced a deliberate error. "I see from your file that you attended flight school at Edwards Air Force Base," she said, glancing at her notes. West's eyebrow raised slightly. "No, I completed flight training at Randolph. Edwards came later in my career." "Ah, my mistake," Magdalena said apologetically, making a show of correcting her notes. "You're right, of course. Randolph in 92, wasn't it?" 94, West corrected, a hint of impatience entering her voice. "I was deployed to Germany for 2 years after receiving my commission." Magdalena nodded, noting the quick and accurate correction. A deep cover operative would know their legend perfectly, would catch and correct any errors in their biography. But so would a genuine Air Force general discussing her own career. The interview continued, with Magdalena introducing several more deliberate errors, some related to military procedure, others to American cultural references. West caught and corrected each one without hesitation, her responses consistent with someone who had lived the life described in her official biography. By the end of the day, Magdalena had completed interviews with 4 of the 8 Joint Chiefs, including both Hensley and West. Each conversation had yielded subtle observations, small data points that individually meant little but collectively might form a pattern. "Initial impressions?" Blackwood asked as they returned to Langley that evening. "Nothing conclusive," Magdalena replied, staring out the car window at the Virginia landscape. "Hensley shows some linguistic patterns that could indicate non-native thinking. His responses about Russia lack personal texture. West seems more consistent, but her reactions are almost too perfect, as if rehearsed. So both remain suspects?" "Everyone remains a suspect until proven otherwise." Magdalena turned from the window. "Tomorrow I interview Kruger. His file shows the most concerning patterns, especially his relationship with the Russian-American professor." That night, Magdalena worked late in her secure office at Langley, reviewing transcripts of the day's interviews and preparing for the next round. As she studied Lieutenant General James Kruger's file for the 3rd time, searching for subtle inconsistencies, Director Williams entered without knocking. "Working late," he observed, taking a seat across from her. "Old habits," she replied, setting aside the file. 30 years of analyzing conversations after hours doesn't fade quickly." Williams nodded understanding. "First impressions of our suspects?" "Nothing definitive yet. Hensley concerns me the most so far. There's something rehearsed about his personal history, especially regarding the Cold War period. West seems more authentic, but I need more time with her." "And your approach tomorrow with Kruger?" Magdalena leaned back in her chair. "More direct. His connections to Professor Baranov at Georgetown are too convenient to ignore. I'll probe that relationship specifically, see how he reacts to scrutiny." Williams studied her for a moment. "You know, most counterintelligence specialists would have demanded surveillance teams, electronic monitoring, full background investigations before even beginning interviews." "Those approaches have their place," Magdalena acknowledged. "But deep cover operatives, especially those placed decades ago, are trained to withstand such measures. They expect them. What they don't expect is someone who thinks like they do, who understands the psychological burden of living a lie for decades. Someone like you, Williams observed. Yes. She met his gaze directly. When you live as someone else for 30 years, you develop intuitions that can't be taught in training programs or captured in counterintelligence manuals. You learn to recognize the small fractures that form when a person lives divided against themselves. And you believe you can identify those fractures in our suspects? Given enough time and the right circumstances, yes. She paused, considering her next words carefully. But I need your authorization for a more provocative approach. Williams? Expression remained neutral. Explain. Tomorrow night, the Defense Department is hosting a reception for visiting NATO officials. All 3 of our primary suspects will be attending. I want to be there, not as a counterintelligence consultant, but as your personal guest. Creating an unexpected encounter outside the controlled interview environment, Williams surmised, understanding her strategy. Precisely. I want to observe them in a social setting, watch how they interact with the NATO representatives, particularly those from former Eastern Bloc countries. And I want to create a moment of uncertainty about my role and purpose. Williams considered the proposal. It's unorthodox. So is identifying sleeper agents who've been embedded for 3 decades. Magdalena countered. Conventional methods won't work here. After a moment, Williams nodded. Approved. I'll make the arrangements. He stood to leave, then paused at the door. Magdalena, I know you've spent your career working alone, making independent judgments. But on this operation, you have resources. Use them if needed. She acknowledged his advice with a slight nod, though they both knew her greatest strength lay in her solitary perspective, the unique viewpoint of someone who had lived on the other side of the mirror. The following morning, Lieutenant General James Kruger sat across from Magdalena, his posture military perfect, his expression carefully neutral. At 62, he was the oldest of her primary suspects, his career spanning nearly 4 decades of Army service. General Kruger, she began, thank you for making time for this interview. I understand you're preparing for deployment to NATO headquarters next month. That's correct, he confirmed. A 2-year assignment coordinating multinational training initiatives. Magdalena noted his clipped, efficient speech pattern, typical of career military officers, but also reminiscent of someone trained to minimize linguistic tells. The interview proceeded methodically, following the established pattern of security questions interspersed with personal inquiries. Kruger's answers were precise, detailed, and consistent with his official biography. He spoke of growing up in Pennsylvania, attending West Point, his early deployments to Korea and Germany. Nothing in his responses suggested deception or inconsistency. Then Magdalena introduced Professor Baranov. I understand you maintain a close friendship with Professor Mikhail Baranov at Georgetown, she said casually. His work on nuclear deterrence theory is quite respected, I believe. Kruger's expression didn't change, but Magdalena noticed a subtle shift in his breathing pattern, a momentary control that suggested heightened awareness. Misha and I have been friends for nearly 20 years, he confirmed. We met at a defense symposium in 1997. His perspectives on game theory applications to nuclear standoff scenarios are invaluable. Interesting that you call him Misha, Magdalena observed. That's the Russian diminutive for Mikhail, isn't it? Are you a Russian speaker, General? Basic proficiency only, Kruger replied smoothly. Part of my intelligence training in the 80s. Misha has been in the States since before the Soviet collapse. He's more American than Russian these days. The answer was reasonable, logical, and perfectly crafted to deflect suspicion while acknowledging facts that could be independently verified. Of course, Magdalena agreed. I understand he defected during a conference in Vienna in 1987. Quite the dramatic story. I believe it was Stockholm, actually, Kruger corrected, and 1988. He doesn't speak of it often. The correction was delivered confidently, without hesitation, and it confirmed something Magdalena had suspected. Baranov's official immigration records listed Vienna in 1987, but KGB defector files that the CIA had obtained years later revealed the truth. Stockholm in 1988. That information had never been made public. It existed only in classified intelligence records, and apparently in Kruger's memory. Magdalena made a note, careful to keep her expression neutral. My mistake. Geography was never my strong suit. The remainder of the interview yielded no further revelations. Kruger answered each question with military precision, his narrative remaining consistent throughout. When he departed, Magdalena sat motionless for several minutes, processing what she had learned. That single correction, delivered with absolute certainty, represented the first concrete evidence that one of their suspects possessed information they shouldn't have. The question now was whether it indicated actual Russian intelligence connections or simply access to classified files that Kruger wasn't acknowledging. Tonight's NATO reception would provide an opportunity to observe Kruger in a less controlled environment, to see how he interacted with foreign military officials, particularly those from former Soviet states. If he was indeed a deep-cover Russian operative, such encounters might reveal subtle behavioral patterns that even decades of training couldn't completely eliminate. As Magdalena prepared for the evening ahead, she reflected on the irony of her situation. For 30 years, she had lived in the shadows, gathering intelligence while remaining invisible. Now she would step deliberately into the spotlight, using her visibility as a tool to flush out those who, like her former self, had mastered the art of hiding in plain sight. The Defense Department's ornate reception hall glittered with crystal chandeliers and dress uniforms, adorned with medals that caught the light like stars. Military leaders from NATO nations mingled with American officials, their conversations a careful dance of diplomacy and alliance building. Magdalena entered on Director Williams' arm, her silver hair elegantly styled, her midnight blue gown a striking contrast to the uniforms surrounding them. Gone was the cafeteria worker, gone was the counterintelligence consultant in practical suits. In her place stood a woman of unmistakable confidence and presence. Heads turned as she passed, curiosity in their gazes. Who was this striking woman accompanying the CIA director? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. You're causing quite a stir, Williams murmured, nodding to a senior defense official across the room. Good, Magdalena replied quietly. I want them off balance. Her eyes scanned the room with practiced efficiency, immediately locating her three primary suspects. Admiral Hensley stood near the bar, deep in conversation with a British naval commander. General West was surrounded by a small group of Air Force officers, her animated gestures suggesting she was recounting a mission story. And Lieutenant General Kruger was seated at a small table with the Estonian defense minister, their heads bent close in serious discussion. Shall I make introductions? Williams offered. Not yet. Let's circulate. I want to observe them from a distance first. For the next hour, Magdalena moved through the reception with deliberate grace, engaging in brief conversations with various officials while keeping her targets in peripheral vision. She noted who they spoke with, how long each interaction lasted, their body language during various discussions. The smallest details could be significant. A lingering handshake, a subtle aversion of eyes when certain topics arose, an unusual interest in specific attendees. Hensley, she observed, was particularly attentive to the German naval attaché, their conversation extending well beyond diplomatic courtesy. West moved easily between various groups, her laughter genuine, her manner relaxed. Nothing in her behavior suggested covert purpose. Kruger remained focused on Eastern European representatives, moving from his discussion with the Estonian to conversations with Polish and Lithuanian officials. Time to engage, Magdalena decided, accepting a glass of champagne from a passing waiter. Start with Hensley. Introduce me as your special advisor on European security matters. Williams nodded, guiding her toward the admiral, who was now alone at the bar, watching the room with studied casualness. Robert. Williams greeted him warmly. Enjoying the evening? Hensley straightened slightly at the director's approach. Williams. Didn't expect to see you here. Defense Department functions aren't usually on your calendar. Special occasion, Williams replied smoothly. Allow me to introduce Magdalena Reyes, my advisor on European security cooperation. Magdalena, Admiral Robert Hensley, Deputy Chief of Naval Operations. Recognition flickered in Hensley's eyes as he extended his hand. Ms. Reyes, we've met, though under different circumstances. Indeed, Admiral, Magdalena confirmed, her handshake firm. I appreciate your cooperation with my security review. European security? Hensley questioned, glancing between her and Williams. I thought you were conducting an internal protocols assessment. Magdalena smiled slightly. Security has many dimensions, Admiral. My expertise encompasses several areas of concern to the director. The deliberate ambiguity had its intended effect. Uncertainty crossed Hensley's features briefly before his professional mask returned. Of course, the agency's methods are necessarily multifaceted. Speaking of European security, Williams interjected, I understand you've been coordinating closely with our NATO naval partners. Admiral Koivisto from Finland spoke highly of your joint exercises in the Baltic. Hensley nodded, his posture relaxing slightly at the shift toward familiar professional territory. The Finnish Navy has developed impressive capabilities for monitoring Russian submarine activity. Their coastal defense systems are particularly innovative. And the Russians? Magdalena asked casually. How have they responded to increased NATO presence in the Baltic? Quote, preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Something subtle shifted in Hensley's expression, a momentary calculation behind his eyes. Predictably aggressive in their rhetoric, cautious in their actual movements, they understand the consequences of direct confrontation. Interesting assessment, Magdalena observed. Have you had many opportunities to interact with Russian naval officials during your career? Occasional joint exercises during the early post-Soviet period, Hensley replied with studied neutrality. Some diplomatic functions like this one, nothing substantial in recent years, given the deterioration in relations. His answer was perfectly appropriate, professionally detached, yet Magdalena noted how his right hand briefly touched his tie, a self-soothing gesture that contrasted with his verbal confidence. The conversation continued for several more minutes before Williams smoothly extracted them, moving toward General West, who was now standing alone near a large window overlooking the Potomac. Patricia, Williams greeted her. You're looking well. The Air Force must be treating you kindly. West turned, her smile genuine but measured. Director Williams, rare to see you at these functions. Her gaze shifted to Magdalena, recognition immediate. Ms. Reyes, security review proceeding to your satisfaction? It's been most informative, General, Magdalena replied. I was just discussing with the director how cooperative everyone has been. West's eyes narrowed slightly. And now you're attending NATO receptions. Your portfolio seems quite expansive. The challenge was subtle but unmistakable. West was probing, testing the boundaries of Magdalena's role. Ms. Reyes advises me on a range of security matters, Williams explained smoothly. Her background in European affairs is particularly valuable in NATO contexts. European affairs? West echoed, her attention fully on Magdalena now. Your accent suggests Spanish heritage, if I'm not mistaken. Barcelona originally. Magdalena confirmed, using the backstory from her Elena Vasquez identity out of long habit, though I've spent most of my career in diplomatic postings throughout South America. Interesting transition to Pentagon security protocols, West observed, her tone casual but her eyes intensely focused. Security vulnerabilities often transcend geographic boundaries, General, Magdalena replied. The principles remain consistent, whether applied to embassies in Santiago or military installations in Virginia. West nodded slowly, seemingly satisfied with the response. Well, I trust your review will strengthen our procedures. We all want the same thing, protecting American interests. Absolutely, Magdalena agreed, watching West's face carefully. Though sometimes the greatest threats come from within, don't they? The statement hung in the air between them, deliberately provocative. West's expression remained composed, but Magdalena detected a subtle tightening around her eyes. Internal threats are certainly a concern, West acknowledged after a brief pause. Though, in my experience, bureaucratic incompetence poses a greater danger than deliberate subversion. The response was cleverly crafted, acknowledging the point, while subtly redirecting away from implications of treason or espionage. Either West was innocent, or she was exceptionally well trained. Their conversation was interrupted by the approach of a senior State Department official who needed Williams' input on an emerging situation in the Middle East. With a cordial nod to West, they moved away, using the opportunity to circle toward Kruger. He's with the Czech military attaché now, Magdalena observed quietly. His third conversation with an Eastern European representative tonight. Consistent with his upcoming NATO assignment, Williams noted, perhaps. Or convenient cover for maintaining contact with former Warsaw Pact nations, where Russian intelligence maintains strong presence. As they approached, Kruger looked up, immediately excusing himself from his conversation to greet them. His posture was military perfect, his expression professionally cordial. "Director Williams," he acknowledged with a nod. "And Ms. Reyes. I didn't expect to see you in this setting." "Lieutenant General," Magdalena greeted him, "I was just admiring your facility with our NATO partners. You seem particularly comfortable with the Eastern European contingent." Kruger's smile remained in place, though his eyes sharpened slightly. "My upcoming assignment requires close coordination with all NATO members. Building relationships now will facilitate smoother operations later." "Very forward-thinking," Williams commented. "The Estonian minister spoke highly of your strategic proposals earlier." "Minister Kask is a pragmatist," Kruger replied. "He understands the Russian threat better than most, given Estonia's history and geography." Magdalena tilted her head slightly. "You've studied Russian military doctrine extensively, I understand." "Any competent military strategist must understand potential adversaries," Kruger stated matter-of-factly. "I've made a point of studying their tactical evolution since my early days at the War College." "And your friend Professor Baranov has been helpful in that regard?" Magdalena asked, watching his reaction closely. Something flickered in Kruger's eyes, so brief that someone less observant might have missed it entirely. Not fear, not quite anger, but a momentary calculation. "Mikhail provides valuable academic perspective," he said carefully. "His understanding of Russian strategic thinking is unparalleled in Western academia." "I'd be interested in meeting him sometime," Magdalena suggested. "His work on game theory applications sounds fascinating." "I'm sure that could be arranged," Kruger replied, his tone neutral. "Though I should mention his health has been declining recently. Pancreatic cancer, diagnosed 3 months ago. His public appearances are limited these days." The information was delivered smoothly, but Magdalena immediately recognized its significance. If Baranov was indeed Kruger's handler or contact within Russian intelligence networks, this explanation neatly accounted for any reduction in their meetings that might have been observed by agency surveillance. "I'm sorry to hear that," she said sincerely. "Terminal illness is difficult for everyone involved." Kruger nodded, a flicker of genuine emotion crossing his features. "Yes, he's been a good friend for many years." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of the French defense minister, who needed Kruger's input on an upcoming joint exercise. With polite excuses, Kruger stepped away, leaving Magdalena and Williams to continue their circuit of the reception. "Impressions?" Williams asked quietly as they moved toward a less crowded area. "Hensley shows physical stress indicators when discussing Russia directly. West is exceptionally controlled, almost too perfect in her responses. And Kruger—" She paused, considering. "Kruger concerns me most. The information about Baranov's illness feels calculated. A preemptive explanation for changing patterns." "So all 3 remain suspects," Williams concluded. "Yes, but with varying probabilities." Magdalena's gaze swept the room, taking in the tableau of power and alliance. "We need to increase pressure, create scenarios that might force a revelation." "What do you propose?" "Tomorrow morning, leak information about a non-existent intelligence breakthrough regarding Russian penetration of Pentagon systems. Make it credible but vague. Then watch their reactions during my follow-up interviews." Williams considered this. Creating artificial stress to observe responses. Classic counterintelligence tactic. "Sometimes the oldest methods are still effective," Magdalena replied, "especially when the targets believe themselves beyond suspicion after decades of successful cover." The following morning, the Pentagon buzzed with controlled tension. As Magdalena had suggested, Williams had arranged for carefully crafted information to circulate among senior military leadership. Rumors of a significant counterintelligence operation that had identified security breaches at the highest levels. Magdalena arrived for her scheduled follow-up interviews to find the atmosphere noticeably altered. Officers spoke in lower voices. Security personnel seemed more vigilant. The artificial crisis was having its intended effect, creating an environment of uncertainty that might pressure potential deep cover agents into revealing themselves. Admiral Hensley was her first appointment of the day. He arrived precisely on time, his uniform immaculate as always, but Magdalena immediately noted signs of stress. Slightly dilated pupils, a faint sheen of perspiration at his temples despite the room's cool temperature. "Admiral," she greeted him. "Thank you for making time for this follow-up discussion." "Of course," he replied, taking the offered seat. "Though I must say the timing is interesting given this morning's developments." "Developments?" Quote, Magdalena asked innocently. Hensley's eyes narrowed slightly. "I think we both know what I'm referring to, Ms. Reyes. Rumors of a counterintelligence operation targeting senior leadership are circulating throughout the building. The Pentagon is always full of rumors, Admiral, part of the nature of large organizations. These rumors seem unusually specific," he pressed. "And your presence, first as a security consultant, then as Williams, advisor at the NATO reception, now back for additional interviews, suggests more than routine protocol review." Magdalena leaned forward slightly. "You seem concerned, Admiral. Does the possibility of a counterintelligence investigation worry you for some reason?" The question was deliberately provocative, designed to elicit reaction. Hensley's response would be telling. Defensive anger would suggest one thing, calculated deflection another. "I'm concerned about operational security and chain of command," he replied after a measured pause. "Counterintelligence operations affecting senior military leadership should follow established protocols, with proper oversight from both military and civilian authorities." The answer was perfect, focused on procedure rather than personal implications, demonstrating appropriate concern without revealing anxiety. Either Hensley was innocent, or he was exceptionally well trained in counterinterrogation techniques. The interview continued for another 40 minutes, with Magdalena probing various aspects of naval security protocols while watching for signs of inconsistency or stress. Hensley remained composed throughout, his responses professional and detailed. General West arrived for her interview looking slightly harried, a departure from her usual immaculate presentation. "Apologies for my appearance," she said as she took her seat. "Emergency meeting with the Air Force Chief this morning regarding the security situation." "No apology necessary," Magdalena assured her. "I understand it's been a busy morning throughout the Pentagon." West's eyes narrowed slightly. "You seem remarkably calm amid the chaos, Ms. Reyes. My role requires maintaining perspective during periods of uncertainty." "And exactly what is your role?" West challenged directly. "Security consultant? European affairs advisor? Counterintelligence operative? Your position seems to shift depending on the context." The direct confrontation was unexpected, a departure from West's previously controlled demeanor. Magdalena noted this change with interest. Pressure was having an effect, though perhaps not the one she had anticipated. "My responsibilities include all aspects of security that concern Director Williams," she replied calmly. "Today that includes continuing our discussion of Air Force protocols for handling classified information." West studied her for a long moment before nodding. "Very well, let's proceed." The interview that followed was professional but tense, with West answering each question precisely while maintaining a guarded demeanor. Nothing in her responses suggested deception, but her heightened alertness indicated awareness that something beyond routine security review was underway. Lieutenant General Kruger was scheduled as Magdalena's final interview of the day. When the appointed time arrived, however, his aide appeared instead. "General Kruger sends his apologies," the young captain announced formally. "He's been called to an emergency meeting at the White House regarding NATO deployments. He asks if you might reschedule for tomorrow morning." Magdalena exchanged glances with Blackwood, who had been observing the day's interviews from a corner of the room. "Of course," she replied smoothly. "Please tell the General that 9 a.m. tomorrow would be acceptable." After the aide departed, Blackwood moved closer. "Convenient timing for an emergency meeting," she observed quietly. "Indeed," Magdalena agreed. "Contact Williams. I want surveillance on Kruger for the next 24 hours. Full coverage, physical, electronic, financial. And I want confirmation of that White House meeting." "You think he's running?" "Not yet, but he's making contingency preparations." Magdalena gathered her notes thoughtfully. "He's too disciplined for panic, but even the best operatives respond to pressure. If he is indeed a deep cover agent, he'll need to contact his handlers, assess his options. And if the White House meeting is legitimate, then we've exercised appropriate caution in a sensitive counterintelligence operation." Magdalena stood, smoothing her jacket. "Have a car ready in 30 minutes. I want to visit Professor Baranov at Georgetown." The drive to Georgetown University passed in contemplative silence. Magdalena reviewed her mental notes on Mikhail Baranov. Former Soviet physicist, defector during the late Cold War period, respected academic in nuclear deterrence theory. His friendship with Kruger spanned 2 decades, their connections seemingly based on shared intellectual interests in military strategy. If Baranov was indeed suffering from terminal cancer, as Kruger had claimed, the visit might yield little information. But if the illness was fabricated, a cover story to explain reduced contact, then Magdalena's unexpected appearance might reveal something valuable. The political science building stood in stately red brick, its ivy-covered walls speaking to the university's venerable tradition. Magdalena proceeded directly to the department office, where a young administrative assistant greeted her with professional courtesy. "I'm looking for Professor Baranov," Magdalena explained, presenting credentials that identified her as a State Department consultant. "Is he available this afternoon?" The assistant's expression shifted to one of confusion. "Professor Baranov? He's on sabbatical this semester. Medical leave, I believe." "Yes, I understand he's been ill," Magdalena replied. "I was hoping to catch him if he's on campus today for any reason. It's regarding a time-sensitive security matter." "I'm afraid that won't be possible," the assistant said apologetically. "Professor Baranov left for treatment in Switzerland 3 weeks ago. He's not expected back until at least January, if at all." Her voice lowered sympathetically. "His prognosis isn't good, from what I've heard." Magdalena nodded, absorbing this information. "I see. That's unfortunate. Would you happen to have contact information for him in Switzerland?" "As I said, the matter is time-sensitive." "I can check with the department chair," the assistant offered, "though I believe the professor requested privacy during his treatment." While the assistant made a call to the department chair, Magdalena glanced around the office, noting the photographs on the wall, faculty gatherings, academic conferences, award ceremonies. In one image, she spotted Baranov standing beside Kruger at what appeared to be a departmental reception, both men smiling for the camera. The assistant returned moments later. "The chair says Professor Baranov is at the Lindenhof Clinic in Zurich. He doesn't have direct contact information, but suggests reaching out through the clinic's administrative office." "Thank you," Magdalena replied. "That's very helpful." As she left the building, Magdalena immediately called Williams. "I need verification of a patient named Mikhail Baranov at the Lindenhof Clinic in Zurich, Switzerland. Admitted approximately 3 weeks ago for pancreatic cancer treatment." "You suspect the illness is genuine?" Williams asked. "I'm not making assumptions either way," Magdalena replied carefully. "But if a Russian intelligence officer needed extraction from deep cover, creating a medical emergency requiring treatment in a neutral country would be an effective method." "Switzerland has always been convenient for such purposes," Williams agreed. "I'll have our Zurich station make inquiries immediately." By evening, the pieces were falling into place with alarming clarity. The Zurich station confirmed that a patient matching Baranov's description had indeed been admitted to the Lindenhof Clinic 3 weeks earlier, but under diplomatic protection that suggested involvement beyond ordinary medical care. Meanwhile, surveillance reported that Kruger had not attended any White House meeting. Instead, he had spent 2 hours at his home before visiting a storage facility in Alexandria, where he had accessed a unit rented under a corporate name. "He's preparing," Magdalena observed as she reviewed the reports in Williams' office. "Gathering resources, perhaps emergency funds or documentation." "For defection?" Williams asked. "Or extraction," she corrected. "If he's indeed a Russian sleeper, he may have instructions to return to Moscow if his cover is compromised." Williams leaned back in his chair, considering the implications. "We have 3 choices. Arrest him now based on circumstantial evidence, continue surveillance and gather more proof, or confront him directly." Magdalena was quiet for a moment, weighing options with the careful calculation that had kept her alive during 30 years of deep cover work. "Confrontation," she decided finally. "Not accusatory, but revealing enough to force his hand. If he's innocent, he'll demand explanation and protection. If he's guilty, he'll run," Williams finished, "or attempt to complete whatever mission activation prompted our investigation in the first place. Either way, we'll have our answer." Magdalena stood, decision made. "I'll see him tomorrow morning as scheduled. But I want a full tactical team on standby, and I want his home, office, and known storage locations under continuous surveillance starting now." The night passed in tense preparation. Magdalena reviewed every detail of Kruger's file, searching for any overlooked connection or significant pattern. His military record was exemplary, his personal life orderly and unremarkable. If he was indeed a Russian sleeper agent, his cover was masterfully crafted, a lifetime of service to America constructed around a core of foreign allegiance. Morning arrived with news that increased the urgency of Magdalena's planned confrontation. Overnight surveillance had captured Kruger making a series of encrypted calls from a burner phone, followed by the systematic destruction of documents in his home office. More concerning still, financial tracking had identified a dormant account in Liechtenstein suddenly activated with a substantial wire transfer to a Swiss bank. "He's mobilizing resources," Blackwood observed as they drove to the Pentagon. "The question is, for what purpose?" "We'll know soon enough," Magdalena replied, her focus absolute. Kruger was waiting when she arrived at the interview room, his appearance impeccable as always, his demeanor professionally cordial. Only the slight tightness around his eyes betrayed inner tension. "General Kruger," she greeted him, "thank you for making time this morning. I understand yesterday's White House meeting was quite urgent." A flicker of wariness crossed his features. National security matters often arise unexpectedly. "I'm sure you understand that better than most, Ms. Reyes." "Indeed." Magdalena took her seat, placing a slim folder on the table between them. "I visited Georgetown yesterday afternoon, hoping to meet Professor Baranov. I was told he's receiving treatment in Switzerland." Kruger nodded, his expression shifting to appropriate concern. "Yes, as I mentioned at the reception. Pancreatic cancer. The Lindenhof Clinic in Zurich specializes in experimental treatments that aren't available here." "How fortunate that he had access to such care," Magdalena observed. "The clinic is quite exclusive, I understand, primarily serving diplomatic and governmental clients." "Mikhail has connections throughout the academic and political world," Kruger replied smoothly. "His work has earned him considerable respect internationally." Magdalena opened the folder, removing a photograph and placing it on the table. The image showed a younger Kruger standing beside a man identified in agency files as a known KGB officer, taken in East Berlin in 1986. "An interesting connection indeed," she said quietly, "though perhaps not the kind one lists on an academic resume." Kruger stared at the photograph, his expression unchanging. When he looked up, his eyes had hardened to military assessment. "I see," he said simply. "So this is why you're really here. Not security protocols, not NATO coordination, counterintelligence." "You recognize the man beside you in that photo?" Magdalena asked, though she already knew the answer. "Colonel Yegor Kuznetsov, KGB Foreign Intelligence Directorate." Kruger replied without hesitation. "East Berlin, May 1986. I was there as part of a military exchange program. All properly documented in my service record." The meeting was documented. Magdalena agreed. The nature of the conversation was not. Kruger's posture shifted subtly, not toward aggression, but toward a new kind of alertness. The change was familiar to Magdalena. She had seen it countless times during her years at Fort Benning, the moment when pretense fell away and truth emerged. 39 years, he said finally, his voice lower but steady. "Almost 4 decades of service to this country. Do you truly believe I've been working against American interests all this time?" "I believe you were placed by the KGB before the Soviet collapse," Magdalena replied evenly. "I believe your friendship with Baranov, likely your handler, facilitated continued connection to Russian intelligence after the transition. And I believe recent events have triggered some form of activation protocol." Kruger was silent for a long moment, studying her with new intensity. "You speak with remarkable confidence about deep cover operations, Ms. Reyes, almost as if you have first-hand experience." "We all have our expertise, General." He nodded slowly, decision visibly forming behind his eyes. "I will speak with Director Williams directly, no intermediaries, no recording devices. Just the 3 of us." "That can be arranged," Magdalena replied, recognizing the significance of his request. "He's waiting in an office down the hall." The meeting that followed in Williams' temporary Pentagon office would never appear in any official record. For 90 minutes, James Kruger spoke without interruption, detailing a history that began in Moscow in 1983 and continued through decades of American military service. He had been born Ilya Sokolov, the son of a Red Army general, selected for an elite KGB program that placed young operatives in deep cover positions throughout the West. His mission: infiltrate American military leadership, rising through the ranks to position himself at the center of NATO strategic planning. "But something happened that my handlers never anticipated," he explained, his voice steady despite the enormity of his confession. "I began to believe in the principles I was pretending to uphold. The oaths I swore as an American officer stopped being words and became commitments I valued." "Yet you maintained contact with Russian intelligence," Williams observed. "Through Baranov." "Yes," Kruger, or Sokolov, acknowledged. "At first out of duty, later out of fear. The Soviet Union collapsed, but the KGB merely transformed. They still knew who I was, what I had been. My family in Russia remained vulnerable to pressure." "And the recent activation?" Magdalena asked. "The preparations we've observed?" For the first time, genuine emotion crossed his features. Not fear, but profound weariness. 3 months ago, I received new instructions. The first significant operational directive in over a decade. I was to gather and transmit NATO deployment plans for Eastern Europe, particularly the Baltic states. Preparations for potential Russian action against former Soviet territories. "Were you planning to comply?" Williams asked directly. Kruger met his gaze steadily. "I made my decision 30 years ago, Director. I am an American officer. My loyalty is to this country and its Constitution. I have never, not once, transmitted classified information that would harm American interests." "Then why the encrypted calls? The document destruction? The financial transfers?" Magdalena pressed. "Because Baranov is dying," Kruger replied simply. "Not from cancer, but from poison. FSB retribution for our joint decision to sever ties with Moscow. The calls were to arrange his extraction from Switzerland to American protection. The documents contained our original KGB identities, which needed to be destroyed. The money was to secure his safe passage. The explanation was either a masterful deception or a profound truth." Magdalena studied Kruger's face, searching for the tells she had learned to recognize during decades of listening to officers discuss classified matters over cafeteria meals. What she saw was not the calculated performance of a spy maintaining cover, but the unburdening of a man who had lived, divided against himself for too long. "If what you're saying is true," Williams said carefully, "you've been effectively operating as a double agent against Russian interests for years." "Not actively," Kruger clarified. "I simply stopped being their asset, provided minimal, non-sensitive information when required to maintain credibility. Baranov did the same. We created the appearance of continued loyalty, while gradually distancing ourselves from actual operational value." "Until they demanded NATO deployment plans," Magdalena observed. "Yes. That crossed a line I would not step over." Kruger's expression hardened. "I knew the risks when I refused. So did Mikhail. That's why he's in Switzerland under diplomatic protection, and why I've been preparing contingencies." Williams and Magdalena exchanged glances, a silent assessment passing between them. Then Williams nodded slightly. "We'll need to verify everything you've told us," he said, "and there will be consequences, legal, professional, personal. But if your account proves accurate, your cooperation now could be considered in whatever arrangements follow." "I understand," Kruger replied. "I've lived with consequences for 40 years, Director. At least now they'll be honest ones." As Kruger was escorted from the room by security personnel, not as a prisoner, but as a protected asset, Magdalena remained seated, processing the unexpected resolution to her investigation. "You believe him," Williams observed, studying her expression. "I do," she acknowledged. His explanation aligns with patterns we've observed in other Soviet-era deep cover agents who remained in place after the collapse. The initial ideological commitment fades. Personal connections form. The adopted identity becomes more real than the original. "As you would know better than anyone," Williams noted quietly. Magdalena nodded. The parallel unmistakable. The difference is that I never wavered in my mission. My loyalty remained constant through decades of cover. And his shifted, Williams concluded, from Moscow to Washington, from ideology to personal principle. Quote, the most profound form of defection, Magdalena agreed, not crossing a border, but crossing an internal divide, choosing to become the person you pretended to be. In the days that followed, Magdalena supervised the verification of Kruger's account. Baranov was indeed extracted from Switzerland, his debriefing confirming the lieutenant general's story in every detail. Financial forensics uncovered the decades-old network that had supported their cover identities, now largely dormant. Most telling were the records of their gradual disengagement from active intelligence gathering, the increasingly minimal information provided to Moscow, the careful maintenance of appearances without substantive cooperation. 1 month after her initial arrival at the Pentagon, Magdalena sat in Williams' office at Langley, reviewing the final report on what the agency now classified as the Sokolov defection. Quote, quite the conclusion to your first assignment back from deep cover, Williams observed. Not what we expected when we began hunting Russian sleeper agents. Intelligence work rarely ends as anticipated, Magdalena replied. Humans are complex systems, constantly evolving beyond their original programming. Kruger's transformation from KGB operative to loyal American officer is unusual but not unprecedented. What happens to him now? Debriefing continues. His knowledge of Russian intelligence methodologies is invaluable, particularly regarding deep cover operations. He'll never serve in a military capacity again, of course, but his cooperation ensures he won't face the most severe legal consequences. Williams nodded, then changed subjects. Have you given thought to what comes next for you? The training position at the farm is still available, or retirement, if that's your preference. Magdalena was quiet for a moment, considering. Her return to the world of intelligence had been more fulfilling than she had anticipated. The decades spent as Elena Vasquez had honed her observational skills, her patience, her understanding of human nature. Those qualities were too valuable to set aside, too deeply ingrained to abandon. Neither option, she decided. I want to continue in counterintelligence, specifically focusing on identifying deep cover operatives within sensitive positions. No one else has my perspective, my experience with living on both sides of that equation. Williams smiled slightly. I hoped you might say that. The President has authorized the creation of a specialized unit for exactly that purpose. Small, elite, with direct reporting authority to the Director of National Intelligence. If you're interested, the position of unit chief is yours. For the first time in 30 years, Magdalena felt the weight of possibility rather than constraint. No more serving meals and fading into the background. No more being overlooked and underestimated. Now she would step fully into her power, using everything she had learned during decades of invisibility. I accept, she said simply. 1 week later, Magdalena stood in her new office at an undisclosed location in Northern Virginia. The space was deliberately nondescript. Government standard furniture, secure communications equipment, reinforced windows with a view of wooded grounds. Nothing about it suggested the critical nature of the work that would unfold within its walls. Her small team, 3 analysts, 2 field operatives, and a technical specialist, waited in the adjacent conference room for their first briefing. Each had been personally selected by Magdalena from across the intelligence community, chosen for specific skills and unquestionable loyalty. As she prepared to meet them, Magdalena caught her reflection in the window glass. The woman who looked back bore little resemblance to Elena Vasquez, the forgettable lunch lady who had gathered intelligence while serving meals at Fort Benning. This woman stood straight and confident, her silver hair styled with elegant simplicity, her eyes sharp with intelligence and purpose. Yet Elena remained part of her. The patience, the observational skills, the ability to see what others overlooked. Those qualities would now serve a new mission, identifying those who, like her, had mastered the art of hiding in plain sight. With quiet determination, Magdalena straightened her jacket and turned toward the conference room. The lunch lady had completed her mission. Now the spy hunter would begin hers. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.